we have Ayşe Zarakol. You're muted.
Sorry, I'm new to. By introductions, do you mean that I introduce myself or give my comments on the papers? Just introductions, okay. Hello, I'm Ayşe Zarakol. I'm a reader in international relations at Cambridge, and I think that's it. My most recent work is on hierarchies.
Great, Bear.
There we go. I'm Braumoeller. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Political Science at Ohio State. My existing work has been on systemic theory. As it happens, I've got a book coming out that has a fair bit to do with international order. So this was a welcome opportunity to engage that literature more.
Great, thank you, Bear. Why don't we just continue? Jeff, you want to just introduce yourself for the record?
Sure. I'm Jeff Colgan. I'm associate professor at Brown University, cross-appointed Watson Institute of International Affairs and Political Science Department. Thanks so much for everyone for joining, and James for organizing.
Great. All right, Sarah.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sarah Bauerle Danzman. I'm an assistant professor of international studies at Indiana University and a political scientist by training. And I study IPE, and I have some work on networks and the IPE of finance. So I believe that's why I'm here. I'm a little bit of the odd duck out, but I'm really excited to participate with everyone. This is a really interesting and potentially really groundbreaking work that Jeff is working on. So thanks for having me along.
Great. Thank you very much. It's great to have you all here. I'm James Morrison. I'm an assistant professor at the London School of Economics and Political Science. A lot of my work is on historical IPE, particularly British and American stuff about empire. So I'm very interested in Jeff's work on that dimension as well, and hope to have something to contribute in the discussion. Great. Okay. So next, I think it probably wouldn't be a bad idea, as I think about it, if Jeff just wants to give us a couple sentences about where the project comes from, where it's going, things he might want to flag up for us to discuss, particularly some context that might help. Whatever he would like to say before we launch in a discussion, it's probably helpful to do that.
Sure thing. Well, so as you no doubt guessed from reading the chapter, this is intended to be kind of a theory chapter of my next book manuscript. All of the different pieces of the book are at some different stages of progress. None of them are finished, but I have this theory chapter that's kind of the core of it that I'm reserving just for the book itself. I have an empirical paper on what I call the oil for security deals, about the U.S. relationship with the Middle East. That's now an article that's under review at International Security, so that means it could be under review for the next 3 years. But anyway, who knows what happens with that. And then I've also written a bunch on OPEC in the past, and I have sort of pieces of the various chapters already in place for that, but nothing set so far in stone that it couldn't be revised. And so any and all feedback you have would be very, very welcome. I should say that the origins of this project is that I started a whole project, and I still have this whole project on the causes of decolonization and the collapse of empires as a common form of political organization. I have put that project on hold because I got so interested in this one, which is really about the effects of decolonization and the effects of the end of empire. So that's really, if you've followed at all my trajectory, as I know James has at least, that's where this project sits. So the other one is a little bit on hold, and this one digs into the questions of international order. And the last thing I'll say about this, I think everybody's thinking about how international order is changing in 2017 and 2018. So one way that I'm thinking about this is that many of the theories that we have in IR assume that the hegemon is a leading state both in a military sense and in an economic sense. We're getting into a world where that seems to get decoupled, right? Where the US is still by far the military hegemon, but economically, if it is not the largest economy today, it probably will lose that status at some point to China in the future. And we can argue about how, when exactly or how far in the future that is. But that actually strikes me, as an interesting moment, right? So theoretically, we've made this assumption that those two things go hand in hand, but in fact, empirically, we're now getting into a world where those aren't both true. And to understand that moment, it strikes me that this project might be useful because, in a sense, that decoupling happened in the 1970s in the world of oil, right? Where the US was kind of economically and militarily dominant in the 60s and lost that in the 70s, where the economics kind of diverged from what US preferences might have been. And so I'm hoping to be able to kind of draw some insights out of that as well. I'll stop, and I really do want to spend most of the time hearing what you guys have to say. Thanks so much.
That's great, Jeff. Thank you very much. I guess I had one quick clarifying question. Do you have a sense of what the table of contents of the book project will look like?
Yeah, that's a good question. Right now, the way I've thought about it, so chapter 1, introduction, yet to be written. Well, I've written a draft, but it can be polished. Chapter 2 is the one you have. There is a question mark about what chapter 3 would look like. So I have an idea that I would like to do kind of a methods chapter. And it's not so much a method as a recipe for how do we think about systemic level thinking when we're doing research. And this follows on some of Bear's book and others that have pointed out, like, look, this issue of this perennial issue maybe of kind of domestic level thinking, of thinking about units as monads or dyads, it's really inadequate, and we do really need to think about systemic level thinking. And so I have an idea about how scholars of all kinds, especially grad students and junior faculty, might be able to kind of use an 8-step path, right, of like how to get to more systemic level thinking. And so I thought I would write that up, and I haven't quite decided whether that's like an appendix to this chapter, or whether it's a chapter on its own, or whether it should go at the end of the book, what have you. Anyway, that's a longer diversion. But then empirically, so after this chapter, following empirically, there would be 2 chapters on the oil for security deals. One that's mostly about how decolonization happened, and then one that's more on the kind of foreign policy implications of the oil for security deals. So that's chapters maybe 3 and 4, and then chapters 5 and 6 are on OPEC. And so those are the 2, really big kind of overall cases that I've described in this chapter as kind of the empirical basis for the theory that I'm laying out. Originally, when I designed this project, I had an additional 3rd case, and I have a question in my mind. I'm nervous about having just 2 cases. It doesn't feel like enough empirical material to my mind. But the 3rd case was on nuclear politics, and many people suggested to me, like, look, why don't you just make this book just about oil? It's a little cleaner that way. So drop the nuclear case altogether. So I've done that, but the price is that there's only 2 cases, and I don't think you can squeeze a 3rd case out of the oil realm. And so if any of you have feedback on how to resolve that dilemma for me, I'm all ears.
Excellent. All right. Thank you very much, Jeff, for providing that context. I think it's very helpful. Unless others object, perhaps we could just go down the line, starting with Ayşe, getting comments, and after each set of comment, maybe 5 to 7 minutes, something like that. And if Jeff wants to respond to a couple things along the way, we could see about that, or we could save that until the end. But does that sound reasonable to people? Good. Ayşe, would you like to begin? Are you ready? Does that sound good?
Yes, thank you. And thank you for the opportunity. I really enjoyed reading this chapter, Jeff. Let me just say a few words about where I'm coming from, which will explain my comments. I'm currently trying to start a book project of my own that deals with the Ottoman Empire. I've been reading for the last years a lot about the Ottoman Empire, and I'm going to talk about decline. But the project requires me to locate the Ottoman Empire within a larger setting. And gradually my thinking evolved into arguing that there was a pre-modern Eurasian, not state system, but basically an international system. So that's going to be my argument. So I've been thinking a lot about what constitutes an international order, and your chapter clarified a number of things for me. So it's great, and I agree with the general thrust of it. And I'm also, let me say, I'm really delighted that people are going back to systemic theorizing. I feel that this is a battle I've been fighting by myself. So it's really nice to hear, you, Bear. I think there are a number of us now. So it's an exciting project. I guess my comments, the two comments I have, overarching comments, for a theoretical chapter about systemic theorizing. I think it's your concepts and the relationship between concepts are still a bit imprecise. So I've flagged a number of things, and we could talk more about this later when we're having a conversation. So for instance, the term polity and the state, you distinguish between these two, but then you go back to using them interchangeably. And then you have, for instance, on page 12, I'm just giving some examples, this category of other non-state actors, but it's just like a catch-all category. It's not clear. And then your definition of international order, for instance, you say significant period of time, but it's not clear what the significant period of time is. What are the, how do we know the boundaries of an international system? You talk about subsystems being higher and lower, and it's not clear to me if this was a spatial thing or if it's actually some kind of hierarchy of authority. And then the ordering principle, what is it ordering? Here, Jack Donnelly was very recently here in Cambridge, and he gave a talk, and it's, he has a project that goes back 1,000 years, and it's all about center and periphery. So there are very different ways of thinking about ordering principles. So I think you need to specify exactly, I know it's all about ideas and it's contingent and so on, but there needs to be, I think, a little bit more of a precision in how your terms relate to each other, and same thing with perturbation. So that the imprecision, and that brings me to my second point. The way you've phrased the theoretical part of the chapter, it reads as if you mean it to be to work across time and space. So it's not something that is related to the 20th century or even the 19th century. It's supposed to work for all international orders. But I think there's a lot of work being done by the reader filling in, your gaps by how things were in the 20th century. So if you really want this to be a more universal kind of systemic theorizing, and I think it can be. I think you're onto something. This decoupling of different types of hegemony, I can tell you historically that was often the case, that, it wasn't military, economic, religious. These types of authority were not always coupled. It's kind of unique to modernity. I think you need to get a little bit more out of the 20th century and think about, how do I phrase these relationships in a way that can capture other time periods, you don't need to do that. You can say, I'm just describing international order post 19th century imperialism, and then you're fine, I think. And maybe then you don't need to be so precise. But if it's going to be more of a covering theory, published in the IO or IT or something, then it needs to be more clearly specified. Oh, so for instance, on page 15, you talk about economic, geostrategic, religious, communitarian, and then you kind of collapse religious and communitarian into the same category. There are a lot of moves like that where you bring up concepts, but then in the way that you're using them, you're not very careful, which is to be expected from an early draft. And then in your, the section on hypotheses, theoretical alternatives, you think that I'm going to complain about constructivism being absent, but I'm not going to complain about that. I'm just going to point out that, again, when you...
I'd like to complain about that, but that's okay.
It's just the way you put those things together. Again, you're very much bringing us back to 20th century thinking about institutions and so on. Like, it becomes very time-bound at that point. So I just want to encourage you, because I really think you're onto something, to be a little bit more ambitious in terms of historical conceptualization. And then I think this can be also a standalone article about, how do we do systemic theorizing? So those are my opening, that's my opening gambit, but we can discuss more later, the specific points. Yeah, thank you.
That's great. Thank you so much, Ayşe. Jeff, did you want to come in with a couple of quick responses, or do you want to just keep taking feedback at this point?
No, that's super helpful. I'll just say that that's the first time anyone has ever told me to be more ambitious in my work. Almost everyone's like, oh my God, it's too ambitious. So thank you, but I really appreciate it.
Great. All right, Bear, would you like to go next?
There we go. Sure. First of all, I have to, just by way of context, I've been having some computer problems, so I brought in my iPad, and that's why you see me jumping around. And actually, until a minute ago, I had an IT guy here trying to fix things, and the upshot was no dice. So I'm in a slightly awkward position in that I can't peek at an alternative screen to look at my notes. What I'm going to try to do is flip from the Google Hangouts app to my notes. I've done that a couple of times. I don't know whether it loses the picture or the sound. I can still hear you guys, so if something goes wrong, let me know, and I'll come back to the Google Hangouts app and wing it. But I'm going to pop over and take a look at my notes now. Can you still hear me?
Yes, we can, Bear. Keep going.
All right, good. So first of all, I think that my very first thing I would say is listen to everything Ayşe just said, because I found myself nodding in agreement with just about every point. I think my impression of this chapter is that it lays out some very interesting empirics that are tied to a fairly preliminary general theory of order. And on the one hand, I also applaud the sort of zooming back to the systemic level to talk about how things work. I think that's obviously I'm heavily invested in myself, but I think it's an important direction in which to go. And in my own subfield, kind of getting away from the dyad is a really important thing. And I really liked the reference to Hart's, the sort of layered geography of how the world works. It's a neat analogy, and I think it maps closely to the way that I think about how systems work. And so, in general, I'm sympathetic to the order endeavor. Where I had trouble was with sort of the level of specificity, and this is going to echo some of Ayşe's comments. I went through and I read these 5 kind of basic principles that that lay out how how order works. It's multi-leveled, and things that change on one level have an impact on things that change on another. And I was sort of thinking, okay, this makes sense. And then we got to the hypotheses, and I thought, wait, where's the theory? Like I wasn't expecting that the principles that were being laid out were going to be the entirety of the theory, because there wasn't enough sort of hip bone connected to the leg bone kind of stuff, like to tell me. I guess the best way to put it is, looking at it and thinking about, like, how would I write this down as a formal model in any, whether we're talking about network models or agent-based models or dynamic models or whatever. It wasn't specific enough for me to say this is how I would connect these parts to these other parts. Now, sometimes it's debatable how much of an issue that is. I mean, if what you're saying is, we've got networks at 3 different levels, and there are interdependencies among the shapes of the networks, and we just want to estimate those empirically. Like, I'm really agnostic about what those interdependencies are. Let's just throw it into the empirical hopper and sort of turn the crank. That'll work, but at the same time, it kind of robs you of the ability to be more specific when it comes to, for example, prediction. I found myself thinking, I believe all of these premises, but even with the premises as they stand, I don't really know how I would use this model to predict outcomes. And that I found to be concerning. Now, it's fixable. I mean, you can certainly specify more about about the model and make it sort of more readily falsifiable. And in that context, I think you really miss a promising direction when you discuss decolonization as simply a change in order, rather than the disappearance or the devolution of order. If you portray, colonies as, I don't want to get into the sort of high level or low level, but I think in your terminology, sort of a higher level form of order that either disappears or kind of devolves to the constituent units when these colonies disintegrate, or the colonial order disintegrates, rather. That's kind of an interesting phenomenon. And to refer to your earlier comments, I think it actually does tie into the kind of thing that people are worried about today, right, with the potential dissolution of the Western liberal order. So it ties nicely, I think, to the concern that's motivating this, and I think it gives you more of a concrete hook than just sort of saying things at one level reverberate on another level, which is relatively unobjectionable, but then sort of difficult to falsify, I think. As to the empirics, I wanted to mention there's a section, and I actually can find it if I scroll a little bit. It's around, starting around page 29, I think, and going for a few pages, where you talk about the empirics, where one chapter is going to be stuff causing the existence of oil for security deals, and then the next chapter being oil for security deals causing militarized interstate disputes. Have I got that essentially right? Jeff looks like he's nodding, but I can't. Yeah, okay, good, thank you. I think there's a danger and a promise to those, and I take it those are the two empirical chapters that you're talking about and debating whether or not there should be a third. No, I'm wrong on that. Okay, well, we'll worry about that in a minute. But so go ahead.
Let me just interrupt. So the idea is that the two cases described actually in table 2.2 on page 29 are really chapters 3 and 4 is one case, and chapter 5 and 6 is the other case. So OPEC is one case, and the oil for security deals is the other.
Okay. Then this won't help you resolve the two case.
Okay.
But it might help with one of the cases because just from a purely statistical standpoint, it's technically problematic to treat something as the dependent variable in one chapter and then the independent variable in the next chapter. Just because in the first chapter you're saying stuff causes this and I know what stuff causes this. And then in the second chapter you're saying it's totally exogenous and I'm not modeling it as endogenous because it just happens, which is undermined by all the things you said in the previous chapter. Now, the opportunity is that there's a growing number of statistical techniques that are relatively easy to use that help you to capture both of those dynamics. So the first chapter can be modeling the causes of oil for security deals. And then the second chapter can be including that equation in a two-equation model that endogenizes oil for security deals and predicts MIDS, which has the advantage of actually being a causal model, which is really kind of nice. And I have a paper coming out with a few co-authors in political analysis that's paving the way for some of these multiple equation models to be used in a more flexible fashion. I'm happy to talk about it more later on, but I don't, I'm very wary of treating oil for security deals as exogenous in the second chapter of the two, but I think there's a great solution that will make for a very much improved final product. And I think I've gone well over my time, so I'm going to shut up now and listen to what other people have to say.
Comments, Jeff? Anything to come back on just now?
Just that I'd definitely be really interested in learning more about the statistical tool or tools that Bear mentioned. So if you want to send me papers or just even giving me oh, you should really be using Heckman model or whatever it is that's the model that I should be using, I'm all ears.
All right, Sarah.
All right. Well, I think many of my comments reflect what others have already mentioned, especially kind of both. So first, let me back up and just say that I really think that this, it's very easy to quickly get into the weeds, but I think at a larger scale, I agree wholeheartedly that there needs to be more attention to specifically endogenous systemic change and better theory building. I mean, we've had a lot of theory on this or attempts at this at theory in IR over the years, but I think returning to this and bringing in new ways of thinking and new methods into this is incredibly important. So I'm very enthusiastic for the broader project and what what you're trying to do here. So I think that this is well worth the effort. I think Ayşe's focus on trying to be more precise with concepts and the relationships between those concepts is something that in the comments that I already sent to you was a big point that I made, and I want to make a few more points about that as well. And also Bear's points about trying to connect the parts together a little bit more, I think also reflect in the comments that I have. So that connective tissue I want to start with. because now I'm in some ways kind of coming from a different place, because my work doesn't focus as much on broad kind of imperial systems the way that others on the call have in the past, at least. And I'm certainly not on the kind of conflict and security military side of IR. But I kept on wondering, actually I finished the reading the chapter and immediately went through and looked at how many times the word power was in the document, because I found it curious that there wasn't as much of a discussion of power as I thought that there probably should be. You talk about authority, and it seems like a specific move that you make to talk about authority rather than power, but you don't really define authority and what you mean by authority, and discuss how it's connected to power. So, you know, I was left with questions about how do some units gain authority over others, and how can this authority differ across issue domains, which you're calling subsystems? How do different sources of authority interact? For example, you claim that a state cannot conquer a company, but especially when that's like a weird thing to say in the context of oil, because states expropriating oil assets is basically a state conquering a company. And so I think that, you know, without a more clear articulation of how power enters into these relationships among actors, it is hard to understand how we get from the premises to outcomes. And also, you know, for instance, when we look at proposition, which one was it here? Or premise, oh no, the your hypothesis 1B, right, which is basically that when the international order in a subsystem is upended or modified. Oh wait, no, I'm sorry, I want to go back to a premise. There's a premise that basically says that you're going to get change you're not going to get change to the ordering principle after a perturbation if there are strategic benefits to continue the relationship as is. But what happens if different units disagree over whether there are strategic benefits for continuing the system or not, right? So I think more attention to power or authority, or however you want to talk about those concepts, is really important to push the theory further. And then my second point is about the classification and treatment of actors in the theory. So you claim that polities, firms, and non-state actors are mutually exclusive, but I find this dubious, especially when we think about the relationship between these oil firms and both their home and host states. And even when in your opening remarks, when you talk about why you were interested in this particular subject, and you talk about how through the 60s and 70s, you get this decoupling of economic and military power over oil, in that the US is able to maintain its military advantage in the Middle East, but that its economic preferences, the economic system diverges from US preferences. So that, to me, suggests that you believe that there's more of an intersection between polities and firms than is currently in your theory. So I think that needs to be worked out a bit more. I feel like I'm kind of going over time a little bit, but the one last thing that I'll throw out for our beginning of the dialogue is that I think that when you talk about networks, that you want to be careful, because my sense is when you're talking about networks that you're talking about simple networks. And there's a lot more variety in what network theory can do now than just simple networks. So for instance, if a perturbation in a highly central node in a complex network, if that destroys that central node, then the whole network configuration and the pattern of linkages that comprise the network could change to local neighborhoods versus global hierarchy. You can imagine all sorts of ways in which network theory can lead to changes in the underlying structure of the network as well. It's not just what you call a surface level effect. And so, but what has been problematic or challenging for people studying network theory and applying it to an IR context is that when you have different issue areas that don't have clear ways of measuring linkages among nodes so that you can't create ties, that is a problem because you need to have ties in order to create a network. And so I think that when you talk about what your theory is providing beyond what a network theory can provide, I think kind of playing up that component is going to be really helpful to you in making the case that you're adding something that's not just novel, but also necessary to move the field further. So I have plenty more to talk about, but let me stop there for right now.
That's great, Sarah. Thank you so much for those comments. Jeff, would you like to come back on that? Otherwise, I'll offer some comments as well, and then you can do so more fully. But do you want to come back on this quickly before?
I take all of the comments from Sarah, you know, as helpful. So thanks, and I'll just give it to you, James, please.
All right, great. So since I'm here at the end, all my points have been made, probably better than I could make them, I'm sure. But I'll just say a couple things here that, as I say, are probably familiar. So the first one is just quickly, I was also unclear about some of the categories. I agree with Sarah that it seems possible for me for multinational enterprises like the British East India Company, United Fruit, to operate as if they're a state. They have the trappings of sovereignty. They certainly have power. They also seem to have authority. And I don't exactly get why sometimes you want to try to maintain these conceptual categories that your big theory actually is pushing against and obviating. And so that was just a smaller comment. Another one is, there's been all this discussion about the decoupling of political and economic hegemony. And I think as an empirical, maybe / theoretical thing, I'm not personally convinced that the United States is militarily dominant today. And at the risk of sounding too much like a person who thinks about mercantilism all the time, it's hard for me to conceptualize the U.S. relative economic decline not directly feeding into serious military decline as well. But so that's but also I think it's just really hard to know if it came to an all-out fight, to think in terms of Mearsheimer's terms about what makes for a hegemon, or for how do we really measure power. If it comes to an all-out fight between the U.S. and China, boy, I would not bet money that it's going to be an easy victory for the United States. That you have capacity, but you also have resolve, and the United States doesn't seem to have a lot of resolve for much of a global footprint these days. So a war over the Korean Peninsula, over Japan, over Singapore, I just can't see Americans spending blood and treasure for that. And you also just have the difficulties of knowing before people start to fight what these capabilities are. It's been so long. We might feel like Germany in 1941 vis-a-vis the Soviet Union, and could end up in that situation. So that was a bit of pushback there. Two more points. One is a kind of bigger ontological point. Maybe this just reflects some different perspectives on how the global order hangs together. It goes in line with what Ayşe was saying about broadening cross-temporally how you think about things. I was really surprised by or taken by the focus on stability, as if there's a lot of stability in the global order, that we're usually at or near equilibrium relative to the way I think about things, which is that it's a kind of Keynesian perspective, right? Which is that most of life is between equilibria that might be very far from each other, that we're very rarely at or near an equilibrium. And no sooner have you stopped rising than you're starting your long gradual fall. So by going back a couple centuries, the kind of theory that comes to mind, of course, is just hegemonic stability theory. And so I don't thinking systemically, but once we start to think systemically about this, why can't we explain the world that you're observing using hegemonic stability theory? Why is all this stuff in the 60s and 70s not a product of US particular economic, but also then security decline, as well as the US begins to lose its sort of monopoly on much of the world? And then my last comment is about, it's a little bit related, it's about the reliance on the oil crisis, which of course for you, that's where you go to. You have so much expertise there, and you've done such good work there that it's quite natural. That's where you go to think about things, and you reflect on the world, you refract the world through that knowledge you have of that period. And so it's I think quite normal and natural to start there. But I guess I wonder if you need to stay there with your thinking. And again, following Ayşe's comment here, that you could go further back in time and think about things like how the empires actually worked, right? So how does world work after empire? Don't we want to know how the world worked with empire, maybe in the height of empire in the 19th century, so we can better see these kinds of changes and shifts happening. And there, knowing how the BP got established in the first place might then give us much better purchase on the nature of the differences we observe as BP is subsumed or bracketed, right, obviated in the earlier period. As I say, I think all these points have been made in various ways, but those were the points that struck me as I read it. So that's my role as partial discussant, putting my hat back on as the sort of chair here. I think probably best to let you come in with some overall responses, or if you have additional questions or things you want to have clarified or to clarify, over to you.
So thank you so much for all of those comments. I've been taking notes furiously over here. And I have, I guess, 3 comments or questions for the group, because I'm not going to push back on any of this stuff. It's all super helpful. My first question for the group is that Ayşe let it off, but others all agreed that there's not enough precision here, not enough specificity. And so I take that on board, but I wonder, like, how do any of us know whether there's enough specificity in an idea to make it useful? And the example I'm going to draw on is like, okay, so Bob Cohen's idea of transaction costs, IOs exist to minimize transaction costs. I mean, it's like hopelessly vague, right? In terms of like empirically measurable idea, it's not very clear at all. And yet it's proved to be unbelievably useful in letting people theorize about it. And so, I would love it if you could just, I'm not saying that I'm at this point yet, right? That I've got a Cohen equivalent idea on transaction costs. I'm just saying, how do I get there, and how do I, know when the argument is clear enough and specific enough? I mean, can we say, for instance, I mean, just to pick on one thing is for an international order, it has to last for a substantial period of time, right? And Ayşe said, what the hell does that mean? And that's fair, right? Like, I'm not clear about that. But then I wonder about, like, well, if I really said like 2 decades or 3 decades, or what difference does it? How does that help, right? To try to make a clear question. So that's my first question. My other 2 are much simpler. The second one is, especially to Bear, you said, when we move from premises to hypotheses, I want more connecting those 2. And I hear that, and I take it on board. And I wonder whether you can just give me a little bit of guidance about like how to do that. Like what exactly are you looking for in that connective tissue? And then the last question is for James in particular. We've talked about decolonization many times in different conceptions of empire, and you've often pushed back on my idea about, about empire, about how I define empire. And so the fairly lengthy discussion of Michael Doyle's work and whatnot actually really reflects many of our previous conversations. And I just wonder whether you could give me a quick reaction on whether that was satisfying to you, and if it wasn't satisfying, in what ways I could improve it.
All right, well, that's even more for us to discuss. Did anybody want to? I can wait for a minute here and come back on that specific question, but some of the other ones, Bear or Ayşe, Sarah, do you have? Sure, Ayşe, why don't you start us off?
Hello, thank you. I guess I'll take the question, how do we know if there's enough precision? I mean, it's really the amount of precision you want is to some extent up to you, but I just want to know exactly what your scope conditions are. I mean, what's included, what's excluded, because, and is it you, there's international order, or is it the participants in it? So, I mean, if you don't, right now, everything is so, I mean, I don't want to exaggerate, it's not like so vague, but there is a level of imprecision that makes it difficult to know what would not be included under your terms. And it's difficult to know when something is a polity versus a state. It's difficult to know like when something is, I don't know, religious versus communitarian, what do you mean by high? So I don't disagree that these are useful concepts that could launch, helpful, productive ways of thinking. But for your project, I think you need to be more specific so that it's not just like, you've just abstracted one level from the cases that you want to discuss. I mean, is the model you're advancing, does it travel beyond the cases you're looking at? Or is it just, theory speak for the empirics, which is what I think, what you don't want to have. So if there's, I'm not a zealot for this, but I do think there should be an attempt at generalizability beyond the cases. And I just didn't think that there was enough. So for instance, Bear was talking more about prediction. I want to know, the explanatory power, does it travel beyond, I mean, not necessarily predict what's going to happen, but does it explain other cases and other relationships in other times beyond the ones that you are picking up on? And that brings me to this question that you had about, can you squeeze a third case out of oil? I mean, again, I don't know much about oil, so I haven't talked about it, but how about a case where there was an attempt to change ordering principles, but the perturbation wasn't enough? For instance, maybe the nationalization attempts. I don't know, Iran, 1950. I don't know. Again, maybe you're taking care of that in your cases already, but it would be interesting to see a third case where, and it may help you specify when these relationships get activated and when they don't. Right now, it seems it's possible that they always get activated. I mean, it's just I don't see. It's not clear enough for me. I mean, the cases are clear. It's not clear enough for me how we take the lessons from here and use them elsewhere. So, thank you.
About Bear's point about predictive. The theories are not sufficiently precise to allow much prediction. In this case, will we get this result? In this case, we'll get that result.
Mm-hmm. Right. I think that was one of the major concerns that I had. That and I take your point about Cohen's work having had a lot of influence. I'm not sure that in and of itself makes it something to emulate. Decades later, in part because I think a lot of the, I don't know, I tend to be pretty cynical about, about what gets cited and what gets used and how in international relations. I mean, Ken Waltz is one of the most widely cited people in the discipline, and I don't think anybody would hold theory of international politics up as as a book to be emulated. It's widely cited because he drove people crazy, and he left things so open-ended that people could argue endlessly about how to interpret what he wrote. And on the one hand, I hesitate to tell people not to do that because it does get you a lot of citations, and but on the other, it tends to be not as edifying in the end. Let me speak to your question about what more you would anticipate or what more you would expect. And I'll give you a couple of examples. So let's say that you're trying to come up with a way to explain or understand or model or capture Bob Gilpin's work. And the two kind of levels of order that you care about are sort of the international economic order and some distribution of prestige, right? That Gilpin says kind of lags after changes in economic capabilities, or let's just make it power, sort of more generally, power and prestige as two different levels. So reading Gilpin, you can actually come up with a couple of explanations of how those two levels interrelate, right? The distribution of prestige should lag after the distribution of power, but it should be drawn toward the same distribution of power. So you should be able to predict changes in the distribution of international prestige by looking at where the distribution of power is. At the same time, he also argues that the probability of major war increases as the disjuncture between those two networks increases. So you can use kind of some aggregate measure of the difference in those two networks as a predictor of when international conflict is going to happen. And those are the theoretical sinews that make Gilpin's work function. And you may agree with them or disagree with them, but they're there to be argued about, And that was the kind of thing that I was imagining would come out when you said, all right, I've got these three different layers or levels of order. I thought, okay, great. Like, what connects them? What drives changes in one? How exactly, theoretically, do changes in one follow changes in the other? And at this point, it's really only as specific as perturbations. Well, two things. One, changes in identity drive changes in the distributions of whatever across these networks. And two, perturbations in one have an impact on perturbations in another. And while that's probably right, it also isn't specific enough for me to say, all right, what would happen if if the Western liberal order kind of disintegrated or was rolled back and decreased in coherence. Really, all I could say is it will have an impact on other levels, but I really don't know how. And that sort of speaks to the second example that I wanted to use, which is taking a look at how changes in one level can affect phenomena in another. And this goes back to the comment that I had about, I think you sort of miss a trick by not conceptualizing the disappearance of sort of a colonial empire as a qualitative change, meaning either the disappearance of order or the devolution of order to lower level units. Because it seems to me that you can theorize a lot about what you would expect to see when that happens. So, for example, the maintenance of order really is a lot about making sure that disagreements don't turn into conflict. So as soon as that higher level order disappears, you would expect to see, at least potentially, more conflict among the constituent units than you would see in kind of a random subset of other states at other times. And I think if you take a look at the history of the Spanish Empire, you see that a lot. in part because the boundaries, the Spanish were frustratingly vague about where exactly some boundaries lay. And so when the Spanish Empire disintegrated, you know, the former constituent units had plenty of things to fight about, in particular territorial claims. So you see sort of there, you see like the dissolution of order followed by a lot of conflict, followed by sort of tailing off. So that's I think a reasonable process that might play out whenever order disintegrates. And it's an interesting hypothesis. I don't know whether it's true, but it's exactly the kind of case that you're looking at. And it's one that would give me, you know, some handle on what I could say when somebody says, well, what happens when the Western liberal order disintegrates? Does that make sense? Okay. Again, I've sort of gone on for a little longer than intended, and I'll count that as asked and answered for the time being.
Great. Sarah, do you have anything you want to say on these, on Jeff's 3 questions?
Let's let you respond to the decolonization question specifically, and then there are a couple things that I might join in on, but let's see how the conversation takes us.
Okay, great. So Jeff, I should have started by saying how much I continue to enjoy thinking with you about these questions, and how far you're between each of our different discussions and each paper I read and so on. And maybe that's definitely proof of how much you think and how fast you work, but it's also proof that we don't talk nearly enough, not as much as we should. I liked a lot premise number 4. A recurrent pattern of political behavior or within a subsystem is maintained through compliance benefits and strategic benefits. And there you nicely specify these different things. But that goes to the question of, well, okay, what determines the likelihood that these benefits are going to be large or small? And that's why, as I think about systemic level theorizing, I'll go back to hegemonic stability theory. Well, hegemonic stability theory has very clear answers, right? Which is that the compliance benefits are very high as an actor is rising and they're providing public goods and so on. But maybe the strategic benefits are shifting over time and so on. So I guess the question is, what determines the answers to these questions? And as I was reading this project, as I think about it, maybe it's because we've talked about it so much over the last couple of years that it really feels a little bit like part of the analysis and part of the conversation. And the theory is bigger than the empirical cases that I think you're planning to respond to here. And it seems like the sort of second half of the analysis that you've been conducting for several years now, which is an attempt to a very valuable attempt to rethink how the world hangs together by reconceptualizing empire and the underpinnings of empire, recognizing in particular that energy plays a role that we haven't fully appreciated. And as I'm reading, I'm thinking to myself, well, it would be really neat to see all these processes when things are going for the way of whatever the great powers are that are ordering the system. Let's see it working, and then we can see it being reworked, redesigned, revised as, look, a product of the same types of underpinnings. Look, it's when you control energy or when you're a rising hegemon, whatever it is that your theory is, see how all the order falls into place and how it hangs together based on these 2 or 3 or 12 underpinnings I've described. And then look, when those underpinnings change, then the order changes. And there might be lag, and as Bear, I think, quite usefully points out, there's Gilpin, and you get the tension between the sort of lagging indicator of how people think about the order, how they conceptualize the order, and then the material underpinnings of that order. I mean, all those kinds of things can be worked out, but my sense is that it would be let me put it this way. Your theory is sufficiently and ambitious to be able to describe the rise of these empires as well as it describes their demise and displacement. And so then my question is, why don't we see that? of this storm. And yeah, I mean, there's more I could say, I think, but let me leave it there for now.
I'd love to get Sarah's thoughts in as well.
Sarah, over to you.
Sorry, I'm having a little bit of technical difficulties on my end. Can you hear me?
Yeah, Sarah, if it's stuttering, I had that. I closed Chrome, I restarted it, and it's better now. I don't know if that would help.
Okay, if it continues to be a problem, I'll do that. I already got kicked off for a little while you were talking earlier. So, so to be really concrete about some of my suggestions for for being more specific, sorry. I think, so for instance, you have figure 2.1 that provides a schematic for state-centric orders and transnational politics, but you never provide a schematic for your own theory, which seems a little bit odd to me. You have in figure 2.2 the logic of your hypotheses, but you talk a lot about the relationship between different actors and their and the subsystems, but you don't provide a way kind of to clarify pictorially or through a table or something like that to help your reader along with all of the moving parts that you have, which also I think could help you as you're writing to kind of keep everything, to make sure that you're being clear about each of your definitions, because you have a lot of definitions in here. So I think helping the reader in that way will also help you clarify your own thinking. So that's one very specific suggestion for how to increase the specificity in your writing. The other thing that I would say here is that the main concern I have along that point is really about the different actors and how you're breaking them into different parts. I just really don't buy the idea that there are mutually exclusive categories between polities, firms, and a catch-all non-state actor. And I talked already about why I don't buy that for the case of firms. James also, I think, made some good points on that front. But I haven't talked about non-state actors or IOs. I mean, you talk about the IMF, and you talk about the IMF as if the IMF is completely separate from states. But so that's assuming that the bureaucracy of the IMF is autonomous enough that it can do whatever it wants, right? Many others think of the IMF as being basically an amalgam of the preferences of the states that comprise it, and others say, well, the IMF is really just, another arm of the U.S. because the U.S. has veto power in the IMF. So, the question is, maybe the IMF could be an autonomous bureaucratic actor. Maybe it could be an amalgam of its member states. Maybe it could just be another arm of the U.S. And it's probably all of those things in different capacities at different times in different issue areas. And so for me, that's the space that I want much more theorizing and clarity over. And that clarity actually might be bringing more fuzziness in between, right? Maybe the clarity is getting rid of the idea that these are mutually exclusive categories. So that I think that working there, I think provides a lot of fruitful kind of clarity to your argument. I thought that James might have taken on the kind of decolonization question. that you had basically if I didn't get, maybe I missed when James was talking about how he thought about your discussion of decolonization and empire. But one thing that I had a hard time with, and I'd love to hear if others had a similar reaction, was that you spent all of this time being really careful about how you describe empire and decolonization and so forth, and what constitutes an empire. And then you're very clear about it being political, and you're very clear that it needs to be formal in some way. And then a few pages later, you start talking about economic imperialism. And that to me seemed really weird, because it seemed like it was arguing directly opposite what you had just been so clear about defining with the, so I think that you need another term other than economic imperialism. I'm not quite sure what that term should be, but it seemed to undercut kind of the very careful work you did in defining empire, and your argument that you needed to be really precise and clear so that empire didn't mean everything. And then you used it in a very different way from the way that you had used it on the pages prior.
Could I underscore what Sarah just said? Is that all right, Jeff? Yeah, okay, so I completely agree. I think, Sarah, that I agree with both points. That first point is precisely what I've been thinking again and again, which is I don't think we expect or demand empirical specificity, well, let's say clarity or uniformity, because it's not. The empirical reality is extraordinarily messy. That's part of what's exciting and interesting about this project, is to try to move away from this idiotic state-centric order, but that we get with Waltz and, in figure 2.1, states and then, colonies and states beneath them and so on. It just strikes me as bizarre. It never existed for a minute, and it is theoretically extraordinarily limiting, because we put blinders on and don't see all these kinds of overlapping relationships. And so recognizing that mess in reality does require some maybe greater theoretical clarity. And that's what I mean when I say, what is underpinning this? What is driving this? Is it about the distribution? I keep coming back to hegemonic stability theory because it seems like it's explaining a lot of what it is you're talking about, both the rise of the empires and then the decolonization. What happens is that the value proposition of being tied exclusively to Britain, tied exclusively to France, goes down. It goes down radically. And the same thing is happening today in Southeast Asia. Singapore, is Australia, these countries, the value proposition of being locked to the United States is going down because the US is less valuable and asking more of them. That's the promise from Trump. And at the same time, China's offering them more than they can get outside. And so it gives them leverage with the US and so on and so forth. But the basic, we need some kind of theoretical clarity to explain the broad patterns, but the empirical messiness, I think, is absolutely necessary to recognize. Yeah.
Okay, so that's helpful, both of you. Well, all of the comments. On the point that Sarah made about economic imperialism, I think you're right. I should rewrite that. It introduces some sloppiness. So I just agree with you, and I'll work on that. Oh, Sarah, you might not have heard what I just said. Okay.
I didn't.
So what I was just saying, I now have two versions of you on my screen, but I completely agree with your point about the use of economic imperialism. It was sloppy. I can rewrite that to be clear. So I take the point. On the issue of different actors, and this goes to some of the things that Ayşe and Bear were saying too about, are these conceptually distinct categories? I think for me, Bear said, well, maybe you just don't need to do this at all. And I'm starting to wonder whether he's right. The point of talking about the three different types of actors was really just to draw attention to the fact that there are different types of authority. And so the difference about what exactly is the IMF? Is it a conglomeration of state preferences, or is it, a principal agent problem? Those are all good questions, but they're not part of my project, right? The main focus here is to say, look, we have this idea that authority is driven, in a Weberian sense that there's like, force. It's backed by force or the threat of force. And that is a type of authority. It's obviously a really important type of authority, but it's not the only one, right? That there can be economic kinds of authority, and that there can be religious authority. And there may be others as well. I don't set out to build a typology, but my point is to say that the relationships between the kinds of authority that are out there are really important, because Waltz's notion of ordering principle, which, coming back to Ayşe's original question about ordering principle, I mean, I'm borrowing straight from Waltz, right? I'm not trying to add anything new. I'm just saying he has an idea about ordering principle, which is how the units stand in relation to each other, subordinated, superordinated, and that is essentially an authority kind of relationship. And the wedge that I'm trying to get in with this is to say, look, we don't have a single type of authority. We actually have multiple kinds of authority, and that produces, all the rest of this interaction in the oil realm, because you've got, force and that can be used in certain ways, but then you have a real separation in the 70s of kind of economic authority from authority backed by force. And that seems really important. And it didn't just come coterminous with the end of empire. It came later, and that temporal dimension helps point us to how significant the strategic benefits were, right? That it was all about the changes in the marketplace, right? Then when the global market for oil tightened up in the early 70s, suddenly OPEC could do its thing, and that led to 1973. So let me just stop and get you guys to react to that. Is maybe what I should be just much more precise about is that what I care about is the fact that there are different types of authority, and ditch this distinction between actors.
Yes, that's exactly what you should do. That's what you're talking about. Ayşe has a two-finger.
Okay, so first of all, I don't think you should ditch the theoretical framework. I mean, maybe you don't need to do all this work for this particular work where you're trying to explain some specific cases. But even if you take some of the stuff out of the book, you should continue developing your model. I think you are onto something. So, and I mean, I guess what I want to, I have two fingers. One is this question about ordering principles. I think, it's fine to say you're retaining Waltz, but you're not really. I mean, once you complicate your model in this way, you can't just stick with Waltz's hierarchy, anarchy distinction, which is already very under-specified, as everybody has pointed out. So, that's why I brought up Jack Donnelly as an example. You may want to look at his work, recent work, because he's saying it's not just about authority, or it's not just about hierarchy, anarchy, it's also about center and periphery, and you can be center without being at the top of hierarchy, or being an authority, or vice versa. He's trying to distinguish these things. So I think maybe there was a time where you could just say, I'm using Waltz's idea of ordering principles, but his under specification of ordering principles has been brought up so many times by so many people. I think that that's no longer a get out of jail free card. You have to be more specific about which type of ordering principles you're discussing, I think. And that again goes to that higher, lower point about subsystems. Are we talking about authority, or are we talking about, are we talking about? Again, I'm not trying to push one understanding on you, but I think you need to be clear in terms of your own understanding. The second two-finger I have, on this Weberian authority point, I think that is more promising. Instead of distinguishing between actors, distinguishing between authority claims, because really you're trying to complicate how, where challenges may come from. And it's not just from, the realm of politics, but it could come from, the perturbation could come from different realms. So I just want to remind you that for Weber, it's a very modern thing. This, like there's a time, like a contingency to his definition. So he would agree with you, I think, historically speaking. And why not go to Bourdieu? I mean, not the practice turn Bourdieu that everybody is like, using left and right, but this notion of capital, different types of capital, where, they are somewhat transferable to each other, but they're not entirely, fungible, different, economic capital, symbolic capital. And then you're already, you don't need to reinvent the wheel. You could say there are these realms, there are different types of capital that actors use. And, because of Waltz, we've been ignoring these other types of capital in systemic theory. But now I'm going to bring them back. And you can see once you bring these other fields in, challenges to ordering principles could come from all sorts of different directions. So I don't know, just an idea. Thank you.
Yeah, the focus on the sources of authority, recognizing that some actors have some types of authority, some actors that are firms have political authority as well as economic authority, the East India Company, so on and so forth. The fascinating stuff is the authority stuff. And I don't understand, as Sarah has been really powerful on this, I don't quite understand the fixation on the formal, legal, political aspects of imperialism when you have this kind of cool thing about authority, which can be more or less formal and so on. But I've talked so much, and I'm mindful of time, so I'm going to stop talking. Let's have Bear and then Tara again, and then closing thoughts from Jeff.
Okay. I think to answer your question, I do think that looking at different hierarchies that are based on different kinds of authority is really very interesting, and it's in fact so interesting that I have very little to say about it because I haven't really thought about it very much. Ayşe's comments reflect sort of thinking about where these different hierarchies come from, and a first cut at that might be simply absolute advantage. I mean, if you've got lots of money, you're probably going to buy off your hierarchy. If you've got lots of guns, you're probably going to, that sort of thing. It's one possibility. Then the question becomes, what are the implications for how these hierarchies interact, both of the fact of their different authority and of the origins of that different authority. I think it's really interesting. I don't know that it sounds like a whole separate project, frankly, it sounds big enough to be a project of its own. Let's put it that way. One of the best pieces of advice I got as a junior person was from Beth Simmons, who said, always think in terms of the minimally publishable unit, or MPU, right? And it strikes me that this is a separate, this could be two MPUs rather than one. On the question of empire, I'm probably the least qualified person on the call to talk about this, but I found the definition a little bit frustrating for a couple of reasons. First, as Ayşe's mentioned, it does seem a little temporally bounded. I can think of a couple examples, the Persian Empire being the first one to come to mind, where there was actually very little direct control over domestic politics, and surprisingly loose control over foreign policy, except, when we come for soldiers, you better give them to us. So I think, even the sort of minimal definition that's given there, struck me as not applying to all empires at all times. And then the discussion of cats and dogs, I read that and you said, well, this sounds a lot like coercive relationships that exist, with great powers. But that shouldn't be a problem because, cats and dogs both have four legs and tails and so on and so forth. And I thought, well, yeah, but the purpose of a definition is to help me distinguish a cat from a dog. And based on this definition, I can't. I'm still very unclear about what distinguishes, those kinds of relationships from others. And I think this, to get back to the first point, I think the distinction between different sources of authority might be very helpful because at a first cut, I tend to think of empires as hierarchies that are in which the source of authority is coercion, and that might not be, you know, a complete definition, but it strikes me as at a first cut doing more to separate empires from other kinds of hierarchies than the other things we've been discussing. Again, all with the caveat that I have virtually no idea what I'm talking about on this subject, so take that for what it's worth.
I'll just quickly say that I agree that the most interesting component of the theorizing is this idea of like bringing to the fore different sources of authority, and that it's not quite as clear as it could be as written right now, that that's the central component of what you're doing. And so bringing that to the fore, not spending so much time on, you know, talking about classifying different units, and instead focusing on the authority, because each unit is conceptually fuzzy, but also could likely draw on different sources of authority, not just one. And then also trying to think about, are sources of authority always creating hierarchies, or are there other ways in which authority is expressed? So are there certain types of authority that are expressed actually through decentralization? This is not, I hesitate to use this example because I haven't thought it through in its entirety. But for instance, when you think about Bitcoin, some of why a certain segment of the population likes Bitcoin and sees it as useful is because it is decentralized rather than hierarchical. Now the reason why I was hesitant to bring that up is because then you can talk about, well, you know, but states are going to quash Bitcoin anyway, so how is that useful? But you know, the idea I think still is there that as you go forward with that authority, I would be thinking about different sources of authority, I would be careful to not fall into the trap that all authority is expressed through hierarchies. And I'll leave it there.
I'll offer very briefly. I will just. This is like the title of the project: Authority in International Politics. That's what this is about. The fascinating thing is that authority can be vested in different types of actors, different types of entities. Some have all the different sources of authority. Some gain some trade some off against others. Some have the one but not the other. Some want this one. You know, it's really neat. Sarah's exactly right. You can have authority expressed hierarchically. You can have authority by leading by example, just demonstration effects, modeling, this type of thing. You know, you're an authority on the subject. You just say something, listen to you, not because you're forcing them to, but because people respect you, they defer to you, that kind of thing. And this as a kind of organizing principle, a single organizing principle of global politics, is, I think, immensely powerful, under-conceptualized. It's a lot of what is actually going on in your work, even though I think you fall into this kind of like formal political legal stuff and typing actors, and you just say, no, the empirics are messy. Waltz doesn't work. What we're really talking about here is authority, different types of authority, how it comes, how it goes. Some of it is hard power, some of it's soft power. It expresses itself in different ways and so on. That would be my upshot of this. But okay, hat back on as the moderator here. It's time to go. Sad though it is. Jeff, would you like to offer some concluding remarks before we go?
Just to say thank you to all of you. This has definitely been really helpful in pushing my thinking forward. And so I will once again go back to the drawing board. In fact, this whole semester has been an iterative sense in which I go back and revise. I take it on the road, people hammer it, I go back and do it again. So this is the nature of the beast, and you guys have been really helpful in pushing me forward. I would ask as a favor, you know, if there are things that, you know, types of literatures that have come up that you think I could benefit from, please send me either, you know, the articles themselves or the references to them. the Jack Donnelly stuff that Ayşe's mentioned, I have actually been reading recently, and so that's actually cited in the paper already. But if there are other things that you want me to read, by all means, please send them to me, and don't be shy about your own work as well. And so I'm happy to do it, especially bears and stuff on the statistical side. By all means, I hope to have things that I can do with stata commands, not with getting into R or what have you. But let me know.
Well, I've got good news and bad news. The good news is that a link to the paper is already in your inbox. The bad news is there's no stata version, but, but the R version isn't too difficult to use. So,
okay. Okay. Awesome. Thank you guys so much.
All right, with that, we'll close. I know we could continue this for hours, and it's a nice Friday evening here, so ideally we'd get pints and do that. But mindful of the time, let's save this. Let's continue this again at the next conference, or perhaps in virtual IPES subsequently. I want to thank all of you for participating, for giving such great comments, constructive feedback to Jeff. I want to thank Jeff for really providing a fantastic, fascinating chapter for us that is so provocative and so interesting and filled with so much promise. The other thing I'd like to do is just encourage all of you to submit your own work for virtual IPES, to encourage other colleagues, scholars We define IPE very broadly, so it can be different kinds of work. The idea is to just try to get different types of scholars together who can get together more easily in cyberspace than perhaps in meat space, as they say, and talk about good work and provide some good feedback. So please do encourage people. Our last call for papers, our latest call for papers is out, and the deadline, I think, today. So please do submit your work or encourage others to do the same.
All right. Thank you all very much.
All right. Thank you all. Nice to see you, and talk soon.